I was a consultant for Lord of the Rings, Tales of the Middle-earth. I got contracted by Wizards of the Coast to see not yet finalized versions of cards from the set, asking me to comment on their power level, build decks with the new cards for internal playtesters, and comment on whether I think specific cards would be positive inclusions for Modern. Now, I'm able to discuss some of the more interesting stories and ways the designs have changed. Aspiring Spike was the other consultant, although we worked separately and did not communicate much. I assume the goal from the beginning was to get two unbiased, independent trains of thought sifting through the card file, making it harder for mistakes or errors to escape uncaught. The goal that was outlined for us was for the set to make a noticeable, slightly bigger than a standard legal set impact on Modern, without being a Modern Horizons 2 style upheaval. Specifically, the play design team was looking to introduce around 3 to 5 strong cards with lasting impact on the format, and a dozen or so of more fringe options that will show up here and there. Magic sets are created and designed well in advance. I did my consulting work in early 2022, right before Lurus was banned in Modern, and I was only brought into the project when a lion's share of work has already been completed. Participating in it made it clear to me how powerful hindsight can be. The landscape of Modern was different back then, and it's nearly impossible to foresee all the intertwined impacts of bans and new releases. And now, let's begin with the biggest card of the set, the One Ring. While it started with an even more epic name, it was originally called the One Ring, the Ruling Ring, it was also a much less exciting competitive card. It was an unwieldy 5-mana equipment requiring creature sacrifices to equip and letting you Wheel of Fortune your hand in a much more convoluted way. I tried to build something around cheating this version of the One Ring into play with Stoneforge Mystic, but it seemed hard to do and there were so many hoops to jump through that it seemed like mostly an ignorable card for the purposes of my work. I can only assume that as a flagship card of the set it underwent many changes, perhaps specifically because the original version sparked so little excitement among us consultants, and unfortunately I did not get to see the final version of the One Ring we get to play with nowadays. I was slightly surprised to see the current version of the One Ring as the first previewed card from the set, but at that point I filtered it out, still thinking of it as a card aimed mostly at Commander, only to revisit it together with the rest of the player base when the set actually released. There are a few subtle factors contributing to the One Ring's power, the way life loss is delayed, being a colorless artifact, which puts no limits on where you can put the One Ring in, and the legend rule serves as a great way to get rid of rings with too many counters, making it so that the drawback is a little bit too easy to escape from. In the recent banlist update announcement, Wizards expressed that they are watching the One Ring's performance in Modern closely, but so far deem it acceptable. Personally, I would be happy if the One Ring was released in a slightly weaker version. On the other hand, producing a 4-mana sorcery speed card advantage tool that is strong enough to see widespread play in Modern is an impressive feat on its own, and incentivizing players to run expensive cards is not necessarily a bad thing. I prefer when cards like this have more deck building restrictions. Yawgmoth, Thran Physician comes to mind, but time will tell how the One Ring will fit into the Modern format. That's how the first version of Orcish Bowmasters I've seen looked like. While the card struck me as an obvious constructed plant, I commented saying that the design seemed slightly underpowered and it would need a buff in order to see play in Modern. Afterwards, the design has been changed to what we have now and I haven't commented further. It has to be remembered that back then, actual card was fairly rare in the format, but that has changed with the One Ring. The One Ring and Orcish Bowmasters are no doubt the two strongest cards from the set, and a combination of their impacts on Modern had a bunch of second order effects. Ragavan went from an overall excellent card to a straight up liability at times. Both the Ring and Bowmasters match up well against Hammer and Creativity, flipping the scripts of a few popular matchups. All that ends with Rakdos Scam, Cascade and various Ring decks on the top of the metagame, sort of restructuring the power hierarchy of the format despite the relatively small amount of new cards introduced. That said, I'm not mad seeing where the design ended. Bowmasters is very powerful and it guides the metagame in some subtle ways, but I like how, as is, it serves as an effective foil to Ragavan and the One Ring, and I like how it offers black a powerful midrange option when that color has been struggling in Modern for a while. At the same time, there are matchups where the card is not much more than a black Raise the Alarm, so I think the power level is spot on. Sauron's Ransom used to target an opponent in its first iteration. A piece of feedback I felt strongly about was to make Ransom worded like fact or fiction, so that it would get past Veil of Summer. I think Veil is powerful enough against blue and black's interaction, and letting Veil potentially counter a draw spell too would just be a bad play pattern and a significant blow to Ransom's playability. Ransom so far has seen some play in blue-black control, although it's arguable whether it's better in that role than Archmage's Charm. Rivendell's first incarnation looked like this. I could have imagined some versions of Modern Control accepting it as a straight up tap land, using it as a card advantage tool alongside of a wall of counter spells. Losing to a literal land over the course of a long game can be no fun, and the upside of Rivendell seemed low enough that it makes sense to me that it got eventually changed to its current version, even if now it awkwardly shares its effect with Castle Vantress. Dawn of a New Age used to be a sorcery with the text you see on screen. Admittedly, it did not feel particularly wide or much like a sorcery, so I understand why the design was changed. The released version of Dawn is a more functioning game piece, but as an enchantment it is inherently slower and more interactable. While often that's desirable, I wish some better middle ground between power level and functionality could have been found for this one. Forge Anew was fairly similar to how it is now. The only difference was that you could equip with it for free during opponent's turns too. I made a slight remark about how dominating that ability seemed against red removal, which seemingly prompted the play design team to change it to only work during your turn. I thought it was a very nice idea to release a powerful 3-mana card to serve as at least a slight incentive to abandon Lurrus. Of course, realizing that most likely complying with Lurrus's restriction will still be optimal. With Lurrus out of the picture, Hammer slowly fell off from its tier 1 status, and nowadays it's a pretty badly positioned deck. But all of the Hammer lists at the last Pro Tour went with a copy or two of Forge Anew. I think I initially overestimated the card's impact, but it seems to have found a nice home in Hammer, and I think it's a positive inclusion in Modern. I felt Flame of Honor was appropriately powered to be fringe but interesting semi-playable, although I suggested giving it the ability to hit planeswalkers for both power level and gameplay reasons. Unfortunately for Modern, the creative team decided that since there are no planeswalkers in the Tolkien lore, cards referencing them shouldn't be printed in the set at all. Play design explored options, even considering deal 5 damage to any non-player target, but it was ultimately discarded as too weird or not fully supported by the rules. That said, Flame of Honor still managed to top 8 the last Pro Tour, in a no wizards deck no less, in the sideboard of Kai Bude's Rhinos deck. Gandalf's Sanction in its first iteration was a 2-mana instant. I pointed out how as an instant it might actually be a powerful enough tool, potentially dealing a significant amount of direct damage to opponents out of a control deck. It was more of a fan of gameplay concern rather than a power level one. At some point it would just become wrong to play creatures against a control deck, which feels like an unpleasant play pattern. The team agreed with me and nerfed the card to a 3-mana sorcery, relegating it fully to limited. I deemed Stern Scalding too weak in its initial version, which only countered creatures with power 2 or less. I proposed to make it able to target creatures with 3 or less power, citing Merclite Regent, Fury, and Lurrus as some of the relevant targets that the change would open up. Instead, play design went with a change proposed by Spike, countering creatures with power or toughness 2 or less, which was funnily enough again mainly justified by Lurrus's existence. Since the card depicts Gandalf yelling at the hobbits, most of which are depicted as tutus or smaller, the latter idea won out. That broadened Scalding just enough to be an interesting fringe sideboard card, and we occasionally see it in blue decks. Samwise Gamgee was first presented to me without the non-token creature clause, which turned out to be a typo in the version of the card file I got. Without it, Samwise into Chatterfang would not only produce infinite foods and squirrels, but it would also freeze the game and force a draw, triple Oblivion Ring style. I ask if there is a way to make Samwise a mono green card, making it much easier to fit into currently existing game object shells in Modern, but I assume it was a creative decision to keep him green and white. I failed to notice how the card combos with Cauldron Familiar and Visceracir. I spent some time trying to find possible ways to form a 2-card combo with Sam and failed, and just assumed a 3 or more card combo is going to be inherently fine in the format. In fact, some members of the Channel Fireball team showed up with Samwise combo at the last Pro Tour, but by their own words, the deck was extremely medium. Golem. Patient Plotter was originally named Golem the Stinker. I am sad it did not make it to print in that form. The Lighted Halfling, as shown to me, had an extra ability, G tap, add a +1/+1 counter on target legendary creature. The card seemed fair to me given how hostile Modern was and still is for mana dorks, and I did not push back. In hindsight, I am glad the card got to print without that ability, as it's plenty playable without it and those extra words would just seem unnecessary. In the first card file I've seen, Mountain Cycling was present on a Trumpet Blast variant. It's been later moved to Oliphant, but I missed it and failed to give it proper attention. While I outlined the Land Cyclers immediately as potential inclusions in Living End, I failed to assess that players could simply just cut lands for those. All of the best performing Living End lists at the Pro Tour Lord of the Rings ran only 15 real lands. While it was slightly scary in the first few days after release, I am happy with where the Land Cyclers ended up. Living End is a more internally consistent deck now, but its basic matchup structure of being hard to beat with no hate and easy to prepare for hasn't changed substantially. We've also seen most of the Land Cyclers show up in interesting places. Troll of Khazad-dûm gets paired with Reanimate or Persist. Pro Tour top 8 competitor Dom Harvey had a generous end in his Amulet Titan sideboard as a way to convert Summoner's Pact into a basic forest. And Lorien revealed Let's Control decks in many formats run a desirable amount of lands while maintaining a proper blue spell density for purposes of pitch spells. Overall, I see Land Cyclers as a very positive addition to Magic. Getting to work on a new set release for the game I've been devoting most of my life for the past 10 years has been an exhilarating, enjoyable and humbling experience. It seems extremely hard to work so far in the future, but it's also exciting to see the cards you helped create finally get injected into the environment. There is another set on the horizon I helped with in a similar fashion, the upcoming Assassin's Creed Universes Beyond release, but I can't tell you anything more just yet. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video and would like to help me out, leave a like, write a comment, subscribe to the channel or share the video with a friend. Also remember that often you can find me streaming on Twitch. Stay hydrated.